Hey class, welcome to lesson number 45. We're almost there, about to, at the finish line, so just bear with us and we'll try to crack our macroeconomics test as well. So here is the homework question from last time. We talked about comparative and absolute advantage. Both are really important in understanding. Absolute advantage is really easy to understand, right? It's to my left here, and the bottom here basically says that when a nation can produce more of a good than another nation, it's said that they have an absolute advantage. So let's take an example. Let's take two countries, right? Let's take Zimbabwe and Singapore, okay? And let's take Singapore. We'll talk about any random good. In our case, it'll be cashews, okay? So if Singapore can produce more cashews than Zimbabwe, it's said that Singapore has an absolute advantage in making cashews than when compared to Zimbabwe. The key there is that we only compare one good at a time, and we also have two nations, right, comparing to one good. Understand that. It's not saying Zimbabwe can produce diamonds and, Singapore can produce cashews. The point is that we're talking about one product but two countries. Okay, so have that as a reference point in your head. So absolute advantage is pretty easy, straightforward. If you can produce more of something, great, you have an absolute advantage. What's a little more exciting, and actually what's a little more insightful for economists worldwide, is a thing called comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is defined as the following. When a nation can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost, and I think this is extremely key, so let me make sure I underline that. OPP cost stands for opportunity cost. So then they're supposed to have a comparative advantage. So how does that work? Well, we had an example last time. We said, well, we had India and China. And forgive us, because from the last class that we talked about, we got a little messy here. But simple point is that we have two countries, India and China, and you have two products, wheat and cars, right? And what you do is basically you said, hey, these are the number of hours required to make a single product, okay? So to make 1 unit of wheat, in this example, we needed 10 hours. To make 1 unit of cars for India, we need 20 hours. In China, it was 20 and 80. So given this, the point is, question was, tell me the comparative advantage. And the way you talk about comparative advantage is using that opportunity cost, which we have given a lot of emphasis for. Opportunity cost basically asks the question, if I'm doing something, right, what is the cost of it if I was doing something else? A little hard to wrap around your head around that concept, I understand. But just, being an economist makes you think, if you're doing something, constantly thinking about, what is this cost to me? And the point is that it's not just, an upfront cost of doing something. If you're at the gas station, okay, or a petrol station, depends where you are in the world, and you take your gas pipe and you're filling the gas in your car, okay, you're paying an amount of money, okay? You pay about, let's say you pay about $100 of gas, okay? Pay $100 of gas. Your cost is just not $100, okay? Let's say instead of filling in that gas, you're instead at a car wash and you're cleaning someone's car and you're making $100, okay? So the way we factor in it, that opportunity cost is saying, if you were there somewhere else, what is the cost to you? Okay? So these are the questions that you should be thinking, and I really urge you guys to start thinking like that in life as well, because it'll just help you when it comes to the test. It just makes it just so much easier because you're not just memorizing something, you actually understand it. Really important. Okay, so let's come back. Let's retract a little bit. We talked about opportunity cost, but why do we need opportunity cost? We need it for comparative advantage. What is comparative advantage? Well, we said the comparative advantage basically states that a country has a lower opportunity cost, okay? So we compared two countries. We said India, China. We had two products as a reference, wheat and cars. We figured out the opportunity cost. We kind of took India's opportunity cost in wheat, and we said, well, how do we figure that out? Well, you take the number of hours required to make wheat, and you divide it by the number of hours required to make a car. And that gives you the opportunity cost of making wheat in India, which was 1/2 a car. Because when you're making wheat in India, the only other thing you can do, and according to our problem, okay, obviously not true in reality, is that you can make a car. So if you're making wheat, the way you can talk about opportunity cost is say, hey, you know what, I'm requiring all the people in my economy to make wheat, but let's take our example, let's retract a little bit and say we're making cars. How many cars am I losing if I'm making wheat? And the answer was half a car. For every single product of unit of wheat that you make, you're losing half a car in India. You flip that question and you get the opportunity cost of making a car in India. And literally, even mathematically, it's flipped. So you take 1/2, flip it, and you get 2. So for every car that you're making, you're losing 2 units of wheat. So if I have all those farmers who were previously making wheat, they come into my factory and say, hey, you know what, Venkat, you want us to make a car, let's do it. I have to think about the fact of what is the opportunity cost for me of making a car. And that is, I'm losing, for every car I can make, I'm losing 2 units of wheat. Same principle got applied in China in our example. And then we said, for every 1 unit of wheat that we're making, we're losing 1/4 of a car. And for every 1 car, we're losing about 4 units of wheat. So the idea was to find out what's the lower opportunity cost, because based on the lower opportunity cost, we can figure out who has a comparative advantage. Okay? Slowly, I hope all these words are resonating in your head. I don't want you guys to dream about it, but I just want to just let it soak in. So the point is, using our example, we said, hey, you know what? India has a comparative advantage in cars because what they're able to do is, when you look at China, if they're making cars, they're losing actually 4 units of wheat. And India is only losing 2 units of wheat, so India has a comparative advantage in cars. What about wheat? Well, India, when they're making wheat, they're losing half a car, and in China, they're only using 1/4 of a car. So in fact, China has a comparative advantage in wheat because they're not losing as many cars as they are in India. Okay? Again, a very simplified model, but could be complex at first. If you just practice by yourself, I really think that you guys can get the hang of it. Okay? So, what is this all going to? You're like, great, we understand comparative advantage and absolute advantage. Where are we going? So, the next topic we're going to talk about is specialization. Okay? So, let's talk about specialization. Okay, so I'm not so sure if you guys know, but a lot of when you're in class or whatever country you're in the world, your country actually specializes in a lot of products. So, for example, people say that beer, think about beer. Beer originates, a lot of great beers originate from Europe. So maybe they specialize in making beer. India today has a lot of outsourcing services, so maybe they're specializing in outsourcing software services. Wherever you are in the world, each country specializes in a particular thing because they seem to be good at it. Now, before, we always used to talk about just relative terms. Well, they're just good at making things. But now we understand the idea of opportunity cost. The idea of saying that you're good at making something means that you're able to make something at a lower cost. And the way we talked about cost is by talking about lower opportunity cost. Okay, so the question we're going to ask ourselves right now is, how do we make $1 million? No, I'm kidding. It's, how does comparative advantage relate to specialization? So how does specialization relate, this is the key word for the day, by the way, guys, relate to comparative advantage. Okay? To comparative advantage. So, how do we go about this transition of going from talking about comparative advantage to specialization? So, the basic principle behind this is that if you're good at making something, you should specialize at it. Why would I do that? If I was good at something, let's say I'm good at, at one point in time in the 90s, yo-yos were a craze. And for those of you who don't know yo-yos, they were just this round circular toy that you just toy around with, and you have a wire and you just go up and down. So let's say, and this is kind of a very weird example, but let's say I'm a specialist in yo-yos. Okay, I know I'm a yo-yo master. Okay, and you are you're a big Star Wars fan, and you are, needless to say, all of us are very nerdy, but that's okay. So let's say that you are a Star Wars fan. Okay, you love Star Wars. So I specialize in yo-yos, and you specialize in Star Wars. Or let's take musical instruments. That seem to be a more simpler example. Let's say I specialize in the violin, and you specialize in the piano. You're good at it, and I'm not. I'm good at playing the violin. So where are you going with this? Well, we're saying that if I'm good at the violin, I'm going to specialize in violin. That's why people become violin players, because they're good at it. People become piano players because they're good at the piano. Similarly, okay, we apply this in the macroeconomic trend. In the macroeconomic level, we say that countries like Brazil, okay, or countries like Saudi Arabia, let's take Saudi Arabia, which one of their biggest exports is oil, right? And let's say that Saudi Arabia is great, and they're great at making it at oil. Why? Well, Saudi Arabia, as it turns out, okay, has a lower opportunity cost. Lower opportunity cost, OPP cost, sorry about the letters, OPP cost in making oil, okay? And what that says is that, let's say Saudi Arabia needs, they need beef, okay? They need beef. And unfortunately, Saudi Arabia doesn't have that many cows, okay? This is just a made-up example, so don't get me wrong, in real life, facts might be different. But we do know, it's a fact, that Saudi Arabia is a key part of the oil industry. So they must, relative to a lot of countries, have a lower opportunity cost in making oil. Otherwise, they would not be making oil. So if there are two products in our economy, and we're going to talk about beef, okay? That's product one. And then we're going to talk about oil, which is product two. So if we had a graph, right? Let's just say we had a graph. Okay, we have a graph here, and we have beef on here, okay, and oil in here. If we had to just graph Saudi Arabia's PPF, in this case, it's just two products. Well, they don't have that much beef. I'm just making this up, but I know for a fact they have a lot of oil. So this graph would sort of look like that, right? Where this point is not so high, but this point here on the x-axis is pretty big, pretty large. Now let's take a country like Argentina. Okay, Argentina, I'm making this up again. I do know that they have a great beef from Argentina, but let's say that their opportunity cost is quite low and they make a lot of beef. And let's say that they don't make that much oil. Okay, let's say they don't make that much oil. So their graph, their PPF, will sort of look like this. They can make a lot of beef, but their oil, boy, it's not that great, okay? So these PPFs sort of crisscross at some point, okay, right? Now is the question, these guys, Argentina, so by the way, this is Argentina, okay? And this is going to be Saudi Arabia, okay? Saudi Arabia. Okay, so they both have different PPFs. Now here's the point. What if, okay, I'm in Saudi Arabia, okay, I like to consume beef. At the same time, I like to drive. I want to consume oil. So what if me as a consumer in Saudi Arabia likes to hang out around here? Well, our PPF says that actually it's impossible because you can only be in this range because look at the PPF, right? So what if Saudi Arabia just specializes in oil? They say, you know what, forget it. We're not going to make beef. We're only going to make oil. Okay? And let us trade, right? Let us trade, okay, oil for beef from Argentina. Why is that? Well, you know, making beef in Saudi Arabia is expensive, okay? But making oil, well, boy, we have a lot of oil. We can make oil in a very cheap manner. And in Argentina, they have a trouble for finding oil, but you know what? They have a lot of beef. So let's trade, right? And let's trade. So that way, what we can do is we can have the beef and the oil, right? So when two countries specialize, they're able to trade. And what that does, graphically speaking, creates this thing called the consumption possibilities frontier, which basically combines the maximum of the two. So the PPF, all of a sudden, this point that we talked about before is all of a sudden possible because there's a new PPF, and this is called the consumption possibilities frontier. Possibilities frontier. Okay? Kind of like a PPF, right? PPF was production possibilities frontier, but now we have a CPF, which is consumption possibilities frontier, right? Which basically takes the two PPFs of both the countries and says, hey, you know what? Argentina, you make a lot of beef, you specialize in it. Saudi, you make a lot of oil, you specialize in it. And we're gonna, since we're trading, we're gonna combine these two, okay? So specialization, in fact, leads to trade, okay? Why would these two countries trade? Again, we've gone over this, we've kind of danced over the issue, but there are two main things that come out of it. Two main things. One is the consumer in Saudi Arabia can now consume beef and oil. Same time in Argentina, the consumer can consume beef and oil. Before, Argentina only had beef and not that much oil. So now they can get to drive and have beef. Okay. So what's the first big thing? So they can consume what they want. Two, they get to control costs. Why is that, you say? Well, we've talked about specialization. We said that if Argentina specializes in beef, they have a lot of beef, so they get to control their costs. So they get to have a lower opportunity cost of producing beef. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, where people have a lot of oil but not so much beef, what they get to do is they have a lower opportunity cost of producing oil. So they get to control their costs. So what these two countries do is they take advantage of each other's cost structure, okay? And they use that to their advantage and they consume the amount that they want to consume. About the products. Sort of confusing, but very, very important. Okay? In the previous example, we talked about India and China. Okay, we talked about India and China. We said, well, let's think about India. India had an lower opportunity cost in making cars, and China had a lower opportunity cost in making wheat. So in using this example, what do we need to do? We need to basically, right? India needs to trade their cars for wheat, and China will trade their wheat for cars, because both are able to take the lower cost advantage. If India has a lower cost structure allocated in making cars, China is going to tap into that and they can drive. And India is going to take advantage of the lower cost structure in making wheat in China. So using lower opportunity costs, that's possible with trade and specialization. If you specialize, you can trade. Okay? All right. So let's talk about trading highlights, okay? What are the cool things that come out of trading? A lot of things, okay? A lot of things. So let's go ahead and talk about trading highlights. When I erase this out of the board, talk about trading. But all of a sudden, I think you guys understand that, using our example of beef and oil, right? We sort of understand that when you trade and you specialize, you get to consume more than you actually are limited to domestically. So let's start off with the trading highlights. Trading highlights, all right. So yeah, we talked about the fact that we could tap into a lower cost structure. So let's talk about, the fact that we just talked about that when you specialize, right? When you specialize, you understand that specialization comes from the fact that you understand you have a lower opportunity cost in making something, aka you have a comparative advantage. So if you are able to specialize and then trade, you can push the PPF. You can push your production possibilities frontier to the CPF, which is the consumer possibilities frontier, which is what we saw before, or consumption possibilities frontier. Okay, that's when those two PPFs, guys, got combined to the maxes. So we created a new CPF. So all of a sudden, our graph sort of looked like this. And this point at which we want to consume, right? If this is beef and this is oil, we can actually consume this point. Okay, great, awesome. Let's talk about the second point. Let's talk about, before that, how do we get to specialization? We talked about the fact that a lower opportunity cost, leads us to a comparative advantage. Something we talked about, but I still want to have it on paper. Okay. Then we talk about the fact that If two countries have different opportunity costs, so different opportunity costs are going to lead to a beneficial economy. They're going to have beneficial economy, benefit economies if they trade. It's pretty powerful, okay? Because what this is saying is that if you realize that you have a different opportunity cost than your neighbor or another country, if you trade, you can actually benefit both the economies. So this is extremely powerful. And countries found this out by example, okay? So previously, people did not think about comparative advantage. Let's talk about 1,000, 2,000 years ago. People were not thinking, hey, there'll be a comparative advantage. What they're thinking about in a very intuitive way is that I have gold and you have spices, so let's trade, okay? And that gives me money and that gives you money, so that's beneficial. But actually now, economically, we understand that if you have a different opportunity cost, your economies will benefit if you trade. All right, so let's talk about the last point, and then we can actually just do a little recap of this trading highlight sector. But let's talk about the last point. The last point has to do with free trade, okay? What is free trade? So you guys have, I hope, have heard of NAFTA before. NAFTA is this North American free trade agreement that was created when Bill Clinton was the president of the United States, okay? And NAFTA, if I'm not mistaken, NAFTA basically says that North America has three countries: Canada, United States, as well as Mexico, okay? So NAFTA basically opened up trade for these three countries. So how does that work? We'll talk about it right now. When you trade, okay, so you're country A, and you specialize in gold, and there's a country B, me, and I specialize in making ice cream. Okay. All right. Know that ice cream is more valuable than gold in real life. No, I'm kidding. So there's country A, they specialize in gold, and there's country B, they specialize in ice cream. So what's the point? So when I have to trade, I have a competitive advantage in gold, or you have a competitive advantage in gold, I have a competitive advantage in ice cream. When you want to trade, right, it's not as simple as you just, hey, you say, you know what, I need about 10 bricks of gold, you need about 10 cones of ice cream, let's trade. It's not that simple. There's a lot of rules and regulations involved with trading between countries. It's not that simple, right? Because if you imagine, in your country, I'm willing to bet there are people who make ice cream. And in my country, there are people who make gold, right? So if I start importing from you, and I know that there's going to be decreased costs, okay, there might be trouble because the person who's been making ice cream in your country for so many years, as soon as he's going to face more supply, he has to reduce those prices. And the prices go down, his profits go down. So that can eliminate industry. So you have to watch out, right? So trade is not as easy as what people think. So there's a lot of regulations, and we'll talk about tariffs and quotas and all that in the future, in the next few classes. But point is that when you face this different, when you have trading going on, it's not that simple. So what free trade does, in effect, is it reduces regulations that are involved with trade, okay? So it basically says that businesses, if you want to trade, if I'm in the US and you're in Mexico, and if we want to trade, the NAFTA agreement, right, makes it a lot easier than it was before, okay? So trading without rules, and this is basically a very dumbed down version of this, right? But trading without rules, right? Without a lot of rules. There are obviously a lot of rules still involved with free trade, but that is basically leads to free trade, right? Okay. And what does this give us? Well, based on comparative advantage, this gives us and allows us for a more efficient allocation of resources. Okay? So free trade leads us into a higher slash more efficient allocation of resources. Okay? So free trade allows us to make sure that resources are getting traded efficiently so that if there's a dire need in my country for bread, okay, and I don't have any bread and I have a lot of oil, right, we can trade. And with free trade, since the regulations are down, efficiency takes place in a faster manner, and so resources are allocated faster, and both people in my country are happy because they have bread, and people in your country are happy because they have oil. Okay, I hope everyone understands that. Free trade in general, people say it's fantastic, and we will talk about the disadvantages later. The next topic I want to get into a little bit is exports and imports, but before I do, guys, I just want you guys to understand something, okay? If we have taken the basic idea of lower opportunity cost, understood that a lower opportunity cost leads us to a comparative advantage, okay? I want to finish off this equation. Comparative advantage, okay? Comparative advantage leads us to trade, okay? So if you have a comparative advantage in something, okay, you understand that it benefits your economy, okay, if you trade. So what countries do is they specialize and then they trade, okay? When they trade, okay, what this does is it actually takes advantage of different cost structures. So it decreases the costs. This is trade, okay? Okay, decreases the costs of having or consuming, okay, goods, okay? So what did we say before? We said that Argentina produces beef, we said that Saudi Arabia produces oil, right? They specialize, they trade. See, Saudi Arabia is now all of a sudden able to afford as much beef as they want, because before they couldn't. The domestic economy wouldn't allow them to have as much beef as they want. Argentina would not, their domestic economy would not allow them to have as much oil as they want. Simply to do with the comparative advantage, because the point is, Saudi Arabia is able to say, hey, you know what, we have a lot of oil, we're able to produce, and we don't have a lot of beef. We have a lower opportunity cost in producing oil, okay? So we can produce oil in a cheaper manner than you can, Argentina. And Argentina says, hey, great, you know what, I can produce beef in a cheaper manner than you can, Saudi Arabia. So when they trade, what this happens is that they both can take advantage of each other's cost structure, okay? So that's why it's very, very important. All right, so that being said, I want to just reiterate what we've gone over in this class. We started off with the homework question from last time, and it talked about comparative and absolute advantage, okay? And a comparative advantage, I cannot tell you how important it is of understanding lower opportunity cost, okay? So that is something that should be literally in your head, no questions asked. We take that, we build the idea of opportunity cost, we understand the lower opportunity cost country can take advantage of comparative advantage. If you have a comparative advantage, you can take advantage of specialization. Why would you specialize? Because if you specialize, you make more of something, and that you can trade, right? You can trade, and you can lower the cost of consuming that good. So specialization leads to trade, and trade leads to basically lowering the cost of consuming your goods. We understood that by trade, we push out the PPF to a new level called the CPF, which is a consumption possibilities frontier. Lastly, we talked about the trading highlights. We said that, well, we talked about what happens when you lower opportunity costs. We went through the whole equation. Apart from that, we said that specialization and trade are fantastic because they push the PPF out. Consumers are able to consume as much as they want. And lastly, trading without rules, just free trade is excellent. Because what it says is it can efficiently allocate resources, okay? And this way, we can take advantage of lower costs and we can increase efficiency in the economy. All great things, and both the economies will benefit, generally speaking. We will go over the disadvantages of comparative advantage in the next, of free trade in one of the classes. I think the next one or the one after. Apart from that, we'll go over next class, we'll go over exports and imports, balance of payments, and all sorts of exciting stuff. Question for this one is, why is it important to specialize? why is it important to specialize? So the homework question is, why is it important to specialize? I will see you guys in the next class. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you guys in the next class. Thank you. Bye-bye.